available. Great. So welcome everybody. My name is Katie Burton. I am the Director of Strategic Storytelling at Curator Museum and History Center. And the program tonight is Reinterpreting the American Dream. This is an update on where we are in our reinterpretation project. And as many of you probably know, this has been an ongoing effort for us. And part of our commitment to doing this is making sure that we're as transparent as possible about the process. And so because we have started this next stage of starting to brainstorm and plan for a new tour, we wanted to bring the public in, give you all a chance to see what we're thinking about as we're in the early stages of development, before anything has been translated to actually in the historic building, and give you an opportunity to ask questions at the end. I will ask that everybody keeps themselves on mute. You're welcome to have your video on or not, up to you. And then at the end, we will have time for some Q&A. All right. So Shannon, you want to press the next slide? Okay, great. So really quickly, our reinterpretation started in 2021. With an NEH grant, and we're really excited to be able to continue this next round of reinterpretation thanks to new grant funding. And so part of the central tenets of this reinterpretation, what it means to reinterpret our stories, is to rethink how we provide access to our programming, to rethink what parts of our site history we share and how, and to rethink the role that we play in connecting past and present for our audiences. So this is all about storytelling, like the stories that we tell on our site, but it's also about our relationship to our visitors and our audiences. This is a lot, but just to give you a sense of how we plan out our reinterpretation, and we started with this pattern of assessment, tour development that included research, then moved into prototyping, training, for our first round of the reinterpretation. And that process, which took us from fall 2021 to really fall 2022, was the development of War at Home, which is a tour that focuses in on the day of the Battle of Ridgefield and the days leading up to it. It's really exciting. It's been a very involved process, and we got a lot of community input and feedback to develop the tour, and have gotten a lot of exciting and encouraging visitor feedback. That tour is now offered every day that we are open. So if you haven't taken it already, we'd encourage you to come and try it out. And then we are going to follow a similar kind of pattern as we start tour development for this next stage of the reinterpretation. We have in that initial planning stage for the when we started in 2021, we did with the help of Shannon Burke, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, we did develop an interpretive plan, which is a guiding document to give us sort of an outline and strategy for how we want to develop our tours. And at that time, we, based on the feedback that we got from folks, internal and external stakeholders, we identified 3 tours that we wanted to try and develop. We're at home, leaning into our reputation as the Cannonball House with the story of the Battle of Ridgefield. American Dream, which is focused on our early 20th century history, and that we'll be focusing and talking about that tonight. And then the third tour, which will probably, that's maybe looking at like a year, something like that, is called In Service, and that spans multiple centuries to think about the role that the domestic class, the working class played on our site over the course of those years. All right, and before I hand it over, I do just want to acknowledge that we said we had started off with NEH funding, which is really crucial. We're a small but mighty museum, and we depend a lot on the support of grants and donors to be able to prioritize our staff time and resources to do this reinterpretation. And we're really excited to receive a planning grant from Connecticut Humanities, which spans this year and all of next year. So it gives us 18 months to have funding available to work on this project. So we're really appreciative of their support and vote of confidence for this project. All right, and I'm going to turn it over now to Shannon, who has been our guiding star throughout this process and continues to be. She's our interpretive consultant. I'm going to let her introduce herself, and she's going to take it from there.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Good evening, everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. As Katie said, I've had the privilege of being the reinterpretation consultant, working with the team at Keeler Tavern on their new reinterpretation journey here. And so as Katie just outlined for you, we spent some time really thinking about the overall interpretive plan for the organization, thinking about how we connect all of the things that the museum does to the stories that they tell through the tours, through their school programs, the collections that they exhibit. And so really pulling all of that together in a meaningful way. And I am just thrilled to have the privilege to continue doing this work on some tours. As Katie said, we originally, when we came together, we mapped out 3 different experiences and fully developed the War at Home tour. And now to get to come back together and really give shape to American Dream Tour is very exciting. The team has started some work, and we're going to share with you where we're at on that journey so far. But really, I just wanted to say one of the things that I love most about working with the team at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center is their passion for building community, because that's really what I love most about the work that I get to do, is to really finding those stories, creating those experiences where everybody can feel that they are a part of the organization, right? That there is that sense of belonging in the stories that you hear, in the community of people that are working to deliver those stories to you. So if you haven't had a chance to take the War at Home tour, we strongly encourage you to do that. And we hope that after tonight, you will also consider playing a part in the prototyping and development of our new American Dream Tour that we're working on. So yeah, this concept really came from the work we did initially that involved lots of time talking to internal stakeholders, so the staff and the board and the volunteers and members at Keeler Tavern, and then also community stakeholders, external people who were connected to the museum, but some who weren't, to really figure out what were the stories that you wanted to hear, what were the things that you wanted to know more about. And the American Dream definitely popped up as something that people really wanted to explore more, thinking about all of the centuries of history that are incorporated in the stories at Keeler Tavern, but really thinking about what the 1910s and 1920s were like on this site, thinking about all of those ideas connected around that concept of the American dream. And what does it mean? What did it mean to people then? What does it mean to people today? How do we make those past to present connections and make this a relevant story where we can imagine what it was like for the people living here in the early 1900s, and then imagine how we think about their experience then and what the American dream means to us today. And so that's part of the work that that we're starting to do right now. And of course, what we really heard from all of you and what the team at the museum was really interested in exploring is the life of the Gilbert family, their friends, the summer residents, how Ridgefield came to be a place where people spent their summers. And we want to hear the perspective like the Ridgefielders, the first generation Ridgefielders, the people who have lived here, and what it was like to all of a sudden have the summer residents come into their town, what impact was on their day-to-day existence. And then thinking also about the perspective of the recent immigrants, particularly the Italian and the Irish peoples that were moving here, and how did they contribute to the everyday pace of life that was happening? So these were the areas where we heard people had the most interest in exploring deeper and learning more about the stories of these residents. And so this is where our work is beginning as we start to bring in these perspectives to the stories. So looking at the connections of what it was like for people who have a lot of opportunity, who had a lot of means and wealth, and what it was like for people who were coming here to America to try to achieve that American dream. So thinking about it from an inside the nation perspective and outside the nation as well. So some really exciting stories are starting to emerge, and you're going to hear more about that tonight. Some of the themes that we're beginning to really dig into is around that idea of opportunity. Thinking about who has different opportunities, who has access to different um, privileges, and who doesn't, right? And so, how does that impact your ability to achieve the American dream and whatever that means for you? And really thinking about what does success look like, because it's different for each and every one of us, right? And so just because my dream might be smaller than yours doesn't mean that it's less than, right? And so how each of us is really working to figure out what success looks like for us. The idea around altruism and how is it something that we're doing for the greater good, tying it into that idea of the common good, or is it something that we're doing for appearance's sake? Again, making those past to present connections with what it would look like then and what it looks like now. And thinking about the idea of work and how that has changed. Certainly, within the last 3 years, we've had a dramatic change with our relationship to work and how we work. And so, thinking about what it meant then to be part of the working class versus today, and how our relationship to work has changed over the years. Of course, because we're talking about the Gilberts, we'll be talking about architecture, spending some time looking at the building additions, other work that was done on the site and during Gilbert's career. Talking about the idea of hope. There's a lot of hope attached to our notions of the American dream, connected to status in some cases, right? Where we want to climb up to that next rung on the ladder, that we want to keep striving to achieve something more. The idea that perhaps you can never really attain the American dream because in and of itself, it means that you're always striving for more, right? Always trying to do better. So kind of thinking about what that looks like for people. And then when we're thinking about those perspectives we want to share of some of the recent immigrants to the area, thinking about those who work to assimilate, to blend in and seem like they were part of the Ridgefield landscape already, versus those who are working to maintain some of their identity and their heritage, and how those things get intertwined. And then, of course, we'll be talking about colonial revival and that idea that Gilbert had the opportunity to have rooms in his home that he was able to preserve as a museum, right? So that idea of acquiring your home as part of the American dream, and some people happy with a one-room home versus having enough space where you can designate rooms as non-living space. So lots of really deep, rich themes for us to dive into here. And to hear more about those stories now, I want to turn it over to your local experts. You're going to hear tonight from Alyssa Houston, the Director of Education, and Catherine Prescott, the Chief Curator. And they're going to share with you how their work is really informing the development of these new tours, the work that they do on a day-to-day basis, as well as new research and scholarship that they've been embarking on to really fill out the overall programming connected with the American dream. So I'm going to hand it over to Melissa first, and she's going to talk about her role and how the school programs at Keeler Tavern are informing this experience. Melissa.
All right, thank you, Shannon. So my name is Melissa Houston. This is my 7th year at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, believe it or not. and I have served as the Director of Education for that time. School programs have gone through a few different iterations, I would say, over the past few years. And of course, a lot of that was precipitated by COVID and the changing school dynamics and the changing curriculum dynamics too. I know many of you probably have heard word that the Connecticut state standards for the social studies are changing. And so there's been some adjustments that we've been making along the way. One of the things that I want to briefly go through are some of the things that we have currently changed and how those are affecting school programs as we roll changes forward, if that makes sense. So a starting point for us during what I call like the COVID pause, where school programs were on pause and we had an opportunity to really look at our programs, look at what teachers need, look at what the curriculum is guiding us towards, look at how students are learning or what they're curious about. We had an opportunity to do some research into Native American history and also the Black history of the site. So we talked to different experts in their fields, different members of those communities, and asked for their advice. If we have this moment where we can pause everything and make changes, what are the core lessons you would want us to put into school programs? And so when we talk about Native American history at our site, we tapped into the Institute for American Indian Studies, but also the Ramapo Tribal Nation down in New Jersey, and talked to both of them about what would be kind of the top, we tried to boil it down to the top 3 lessons that we should integrate into school programs. And so these 3 things that you see bulleted here are the 3 essential, or the beginning points, I should say. It's not even necessarily the essential points, but it's the beginning points for integrating Native American history into school programs. One, of course, is acknowledging that the history of the site begins long before any sort of European colonization or we went to historic Deerfield recently and they had such a good word for this and I can't remember what it was. Occupation, European occupation of the space. Before that there were indigenous people here who were here for 12,000 years. And so when you see this picture of me doing a school program, when I talk to the students, each of those pictures, I talk to them about those different people groups. And so we start off with Native Americans and I say, you know, for 12,000 years, people were building their homes, having their families, raising their children, cultivating the land, and just trying to get people to understand that lives were lived for a long period of time on our site before we have any sort of European interaction with the space. Then we also talked about specifically naming the people who are here, which is the Ramapo, the Munsee Lenape, and the Wishquizgek, who are part of the Wapengard. And then also that Native Americans continue to live and continue to participate in the culture of our place. So those are kind of the core things that we added to school programs or have tried to add to school programs in the different spaces. So in the tavern, talking about who was allowed into a tavern. So if you were a member of one of the local tribes, you were only allowed into a tavern if you were a member of a church. So just adding one little sentence about Native American history within our programs in each of the spaces to make it really integrated. Shannon, if you want to go forward. And so this is our formal land acknowledgement. We recognize that a land acknowledgement is a starting point. It is a placeholder. It is a commitment to learn more and to do more. And so we did write a formal land acknowledgement statement that is used at the beginning of all of our tours. It's used at the beginning, or the information I should say, is used at the beginning of all school programs. It is, I would say, adaptable for the audience that you're speaking to. So if you have a tour group that's all children, you're not going to use this type of formal language. But that information is included now in all of our school programs and also our public tour programs. Shannon, if you want to go forward again. So the second kind of area that we were looking to be better about teaching is Black history at our site. We've worked with Cheney McKnight for a few years now, talking about Black history at our site. And so these were the core principles, lessons, ideas that she felt at this moment in our current place in education and culture in general. These are the things people need to know. And the first one is slavery existed in Connecticut. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had teachers or students tell me after a field trip, that they did not know there was slavery in Ridgefield. And so that is still, even though that seems like a very basic nugget of truth, that is still earth-shattering for some people. And so that still remains one of the main stories or one of the main lessons that we're trying to integrate into school programs and into public programs, is that slavery existed in Connecticut, and that it was practiced in Ridgefield. The other ones that you'll see here, there's a few more words to them, but it's just understanding that, as I explained to school children, slavery is wrong no matter where it is, when it is, how it is practiced. Slavery is wrong, period. It is the dehumanizing of someone and treating them like a piece of property instead of a human unto themselves. And that in the day-to-day life of individuals here in Ridgefield, that may have looked different, but it is still wrong. It is still enslavement. It is still an evil, I would say. And then talking about, when we can, that different people in different countries have different practices, including the countries of Africa, and that the people who are coming from different African ethnic groups and different African kingdoms had different skill sets that they were bringing with them. Also, that here in Connecticut, once freed, it wasn't like all of a sudden everything's equal and fair and even, that there were people within Connecticut who left because of the legacy of systemic racism in our cities and towns and places of worship and schools and education, really were hostile towards them staying. And so that kind of talks about the discrepancy between people across time based on the color of their skin. So if we want to go forward, yeah, perfect. So our current work on talking about inclusive stories, when we're looking at the American Dream, this was a program, this picture is from a program that we did a few years back called The Gilded Age. And in that program, we talked about some of these concepts that we're talking about for the American Dream program. So we did talk a little bit about immigration. We did talk a little bit about service, a little bit about civic responsibility. And so when we reached back out to teachers this past year and kind of we're talking with the 8th grade level students or the middle school students and high school students, this concept of the American Dream, concept of American identity, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to participate in a community? So that's the civic responsibility or civic participation. These big, broad concepts kind of get, I wouldn't say they get solidified, but they get kind of defined maybe in the 1900s and late 1800s, I would say. I think really after the American Civil War, when we're talking about the period of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, there's so many themes in that time period that we think of as like core American experiences, like the railroad and cowboys and Indians and big money in New York City and fluffy dresses, and I love a good fluffy dress. But all these concepts, you guys are laughing because you know it's true. All these concepts that we think of as being truly American, like public schools, even like yellow journalism and muckrakers and the concept of like the gossip papers come from this time period. And so there's this, I don't know if it's quite a push, but there's this moment right now where people are starting to examine that. What does that actually mean when we hold on to those ideals or those concepts of what it means to be American and what American history is? And so these kind of bullet points here are different things that we're looking at in school programs and that schools are trying to teach to students. And they're concepts that are really hard to teach, like socioeconomic differences. That's very hard to teach. And so teachers and students are looking for ways to learn this information in a very experiential way, in a very down-to-earth way, or a very relatable way. I don't know, Shannon, if you want to, I'm trying to look at my phone, which comes next. What slide I have next? Yeah, you can move through. So this is the current 8th grade curriculum. It is staying fairly similar, I will say, going forward. The focus is kind of having students look into the development of the United States as a nation, like national identity, but also national culture. And you'll notice these bullet points are they're questions leading questions that teachers are encouraged to have their students consider or think about. And so when we talk about the American Dream, we're really talking about the progressive era, which is one of my favorites. It is the time period after the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age is this time period where there's a lot of wealth, but there's a lot of discrepancy between the very wealthy and the very poor. This is when we talk about Jacob Riis and how the other half lives, when we're thinking about tenements, that's all this time period. And the progressive era is kind of the move from accepting those things as American into realizing that we need to change society for the betterment of everyone. Talking about kind of that civic participation, but also civic responsibility. You know, when you live in community, you give something up. What is it we're willing to give up to live in community? And so talking about that and this idea of a just society, or having everyone have an equal playing field, or having everyone be able to access freedom or equality. What does that actually look like? How do we achieve that? And so you do see in the progressive era, there's a lot of legislation that comes out that's we kind of take for granted, like for Food and Drug Administration, you know, the Meat Inspection Act, and that comes out of, is it Upton Sinclair, Catherine? I always mess up his name. Who writes The Jungle. He goes into the meatpacking industry and realizes how gross it actually is. So I think it's a very, obviously, exciting time period, and it's very complicated. It's very dense with information. And so schools are looking for ways to kind of look at this time period without having students be totally overwhelmed with the amount of details and dates and changes and things that are happening. So when we did the American Dream as a school program in the spring, you can click forward, Shannon. We did a Gilbert walking tour. So students did the walking tour and talked about how the Gilberts changed the landscape of the place, the history of the place when the Gilberts were living here, the main people in the family and things like that. If you're familiar with our school programs, we rotate students through different kind of learning classrooms or rotations, we call them. So one was the walking tour. What you're seeing here is there was a set of documents. So when students are in the garden house, they were split up into 3 groups who were looking at those kind of 3 core demographics that Shannon talked about, which is the wealthy New Yorkers, which is what this document set was. This is looking at Cass Gilbert. Then also the longtime Ridgefield citizens, or residents, I should say. And then also looking at recent immigrants. And when we were looking at these documents, all the documents pertained to different social issues or political issues within the town at this time period. So they're all written from different perspectives, and they're different, I don't know if you would say it's different priorities maybe for each of these different demographics. So in this letter, Cass is talking about the paving of streets, and he feels like if we pave the streets, it's going to take away, you know, this old world classic feel, and myself and other very wealthy New Yorkers are going to feel less comfortable here if all of a sudden this turns into a busy main street, it's paved and it's a highway and there's lots of traffic, and I'm just not going to want to live here anymore. Neither are my wealthy friends. And so looking at these documents and saying, okay, well, paving streets, who does that benefit? What is Cass's argument against it? What might be arguments for it, for the town of Ridgefield as a whole? If you want to click again, Shannon. So that was one set. Another was looking at schools. So there was a movement to fund and support schools. And one document is this booklet about the history of schools and the fundraisers and who was fundraising and how were they fundraising. And it is a wide cast of people who are donating funds for public education. There are some who saying, you know, that every child should have an education. If the children of our servants are in school, then our servants are more apt to help us and have time to help in our households. But also, if the recent immigrants who are coming can better learn English and participate and become American within our town, you know, that argument as well. So they're very fascinating documents, and this is like 100 years ago, but I'm sure you're feeling like, wow, this sounds awfully familiar. And then the last set that we have students look at is about public water and the movement in Ridgefield. Like there's a whole movement for urbanization within the progressive era where there are urban developments, things like paving streets, which we talked about, piping in water, so having clean water accessible to everyone, not wells in every household, but having piped in water, clean water, access to water, building of tenements, building of schools, things like that. So the last one is a document set where it talks about bringing in water and who wants to pay for this. Who wants to pay for water? If the wealthy people have already dug their wells and the people living in tenements already have access to water, why bother making Main Street plumbed for water? And then there's another argument that says, well, if the electric company is using water, they get charged one price, but someone just living on Main Street gets charged nearly double that price. And so why are we giving a cut to the electric company to use water, but not a cut to the people who are living and working on Main Street? So you can see that there's a lot of these issues that kids here, they resonate with. I mean, Ridgefield just paved a bunch of its roads not that long ago, and that was still a debate, so these things don't go away. And I feel like when we take school programs and the issues are the same, right? But we're removed 100 years. Kids feel free to discuss and debate these topics and kind of grapple with the hard concept of civic participation, and the concept of, the right to swing my fist ends where the other person's face begins. My right to do whatever I want ends when somebody else's needs and responsibilities are, I'm faced with those, right? So getting kids to think about, well, is it better to spend, we ended the school program with these 3 different document sets and saying to the kids, okay, who would vote for which one? Would Cass Gilbert want to pave the roads, have water, or have schools? If he could only pick one, if your town budget only allows you to vote for one, which one's going to be Cass Gilbert's priority? There's no right answer because we don't know, but which one would you argue would he go for? What about the recent immigrants? Which one's their priority? Is it going to be the same as Cass Gilbert's? Is it going to be schools, paving roads, or water? And what about the longtime Ridgefield residents, the people who live on Main Street, who have businesses, who want to better the town and their financial status by having more traffic come in, but also attracting more people to live in town? Do you want better schools? Do you want better roads? Do you want water? So just getting the kids to think about this period in American history where not everybody agreed on things that we sometimes take for granted or things that we assume are right or a privilege we should have under the fact that we're just an American. This American dream, does it cover everybody? Does it cover everybody differently? Is everybody seeking out different aspects of it at different times? And so with school programs, we kind of get to play around with some of these documents and images and ideas and concepts. And it was fun, I think, with that group. They were closer to being adults. We had high school students do American Dream last year, and so their abstract thinking skills were a lot farther along than our typical 4th grader that we get for colonial life. And so it was good to kind of see how we can stretch these documents and stretch these ideas for that audience, and get kids to really kind of think about harder things, I would say. And I would hope that as we go forward that we would keep thinking about the hard things, the rights and responsibilities of citizens, whether or not you're wealthy or whether or not you're recently immigrated or whether or not you've lived in a place a long time. And I think that civic concept, that civic participation is another big concept that's coming out as I see the curriculum development happening for the state. That's another core piece that I'm seeing a lot of teachers and a lot of social studies professionals saying this is another core piece we need to make sure gets into schools and programs and curriculums, that civic responsibility and participation. So that's where we're at with school programs, and I guess I'm tossing it off to Catherine next.
Thanks, Melissa. So I am Catherine Prescott. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center. And I have been involved here at the museum in different capacities for 10 years. Well, I just realized 10 years, wow. And so I am going to talk a little bit about how we are using our collections for developing our tours and other program offerings, and some of the new research that we're doing, because really, as a museum, everything we do comes back to the collections. We want to be able to show our visitors these things that we are preserving and stewarding, and without the collections, it would just be us jabbering at people, and that's not very interesting or engaging. So this period that we're talking about, the Gilberts in the early 20th century, I think the greatest proportion of our collection does belong to this period. And so we have quite a lot to really dig into. So I've just listed a couple of the types of things we have. We have plenty of documents from the Gilberts. Julia left a diary. She wasn't very prolific in writing it. I think she had one entry every 2 years or so, but it does give us some insight into her life and her thoughts. We have several blueprints and more professional documents that Cass Gilbert did, and various letters, both professional and personal, in our archives. So this really helps us to dig into the Gilberts through their words. We also have a large collection of photographs. One of our main collections is the Hartmann glass plate negatives. Joseph Hartmann was a German immigrant to Ridgefield. He arrived in 1870s, and he spent the next 40, 50 years photographing just about everyone and every place in Ridgefield. And so we have about 7,000 photographic plate negatives spanning the years 1880 to about 1920s, which is just the period we want. So that's great because we have visual, these visuals that we can use. We also have a collection of photos by the Wirtz brothers, who are architectural photographers from New York City who worked closely with Cass Gilbert in his professional life. But they came up here to Ridgefield to photograph the Cannonball House in the mid 1910s. And so through those photographs, we know sort of how the Gilberts were using this house as their summer residence. And we also have a large collection of textiles, clothing, costumes left to us by Gilbert, by both the immediate family, but also descendants as well. And so one of the projects I'm working on right now is actually inventorying and recataloguing the whole textile collection. And so we're finding a lot of really fun things that have not been taken out of the boxes for a while. So some really nice sequin covered flapper dresses, and but also some things that you wouldn't necessarily think are interesting, like there's some undergarments and things like that from the 1910s and 20s, which I find very interesting. So we've got a lot there to dig into and to really fill out the visual aspects of the tours and exhibits that we're developing. So Shannon, if you could go to the next slide. So while our collection has always had a lot of Gilbert stuff, I guess, because the Emily Gilbert, who is the youngest daughter of Cass and Julia, was kind of involved marginally in the beginnings of the museum. So that's how we got a lot of the things in our collection. The Gilberts actually did not really appear as part of museum interpretation until fairly recently. In the first several decades of the museum's existence, we were focused much more on the colonial period, the Keeler Tavern period. So it's not until the last, I want to say about 20 years, that we've really started to look into the Gilberts and their life here in Ridgefield. And a lot of this work was started by Charlie Pankinier, who did some really great research, but he was very much interested in Cass as a person, but also mostly his professional life. So Cass is an architect. And so a lot of the research that we have done was really focused on Cass Gilbert, and focused on his architecture. Some of it talked about Julia, but it was really Julia in the context of her relationship to her husband. And so as we started thinking about these tours and how to expand that lens, thinking about who is Julia as an individual, and also who else was around them in their lives that isn't normally talked about, that allowed Cass and Julia to have the lifestyle that they did. So we often say Cass built Julia the beautiful garden here on the property, but who was it who actually laid the bricks for the brick walls? And we often say Julia loved gardening, but who was it who was actually pulling the weeds from the rose beds, and things like that? And another thing is, like, who did the sweeping? Julia, there's a quote that I love. It's in an article published about Julia Gilbert, that she had written to Cass during the period when they were engaged, where she wrote that life is not worth living without servants. And so, so who are those servants that are allowing her to live this beautiful life? And so those are kind of the areas that we really wanted to focus on going forward. So Shannon, if you could go to the next slide. We've been doing a lot of new research. This past June, I had the opportunity to go to the Library of Congress for a week to research in their collection. They have a really great collection of Cass Gilbert documents and papers. The New York Historical Society also has a large repository of Gilbert papers as well, and I plan to head down there in the near future to take a look at that stuff as well. So I thought the next couple of slides, I'll just show you some of the things I've found recently. So as I mentioned, we want to look at who else was around working and living on this property. And so in the last year or so, we've been able to identify by name a number of staff and employees of the Gilberts. And so here's 5 names that we've found. So Margaret Ross. Margaret was an immigrant from Scotland. She arrived here in the United States in 1905. And by 1910, she was working for the Gilberts as a cook. And she worked for them in their Manhattan townhouse, but also would come up to Ridgefield with the family when they relocated. And the image you see here is actually her passport application. This I found literally last week, which is really cool. And Margaret actually worked for the family into the 50s, the 1950s. So I've been speaking with 2 of Cass Gilbert's great-granddaughters who spent a lot of time here at what is now the Keeler Tavern, visiting their great-grandmother. And they both said they remember Margaret being in the kitchen. So that's a really great kind of connection we've been able to make. Another name we found is Elizabeth Ritchie. She was an Irish immigrant. She only worked for the Gilberts for a few years, but she worked as a maid. She arrived also in the 1910s and as a 26-year-old, and then moved on. And I'm looking to be able to trace her, kind of see where she ended up. And then a couple of other names we have, Adolfo Cimarelli, who was an Italian immigrant to Ridgefield. He and his family settled here in Ridgefield, and he worked for the Gilberts as a caretaker. So he would maintain the property both while the Gilberts were in residence, but also in the winter months when they went back to New York City full time. And we do actually, among the Hartman photograph collection, we do have a picture of Adolfo and his wife and children. So we're able to kind of put faces to those names. We also have Secundo Servadio, who was a gardener. He was mentioned in Julia's diary as participating in one of the send-off parties that she held for for World War I soldiers who were being sent to the Western Front. So Secundo was there, and he stuck around in Ridgefield for a while, but eventually moved to Greenwich, where he continued to work as a gardener for various private estates. And then another name I've found recently is James Lynch, who I believe is an Irish immigrant. There are a number of James Lynches floating around in the census records, but he was a chauffeur for Cass for some time, especially towards the end of his Cass's life in the 1930s. And Cass never learned how to drive and always had a chauffeur. And so James Lynch was one of them. So these are some of the names that we've found that we're continuing to look into to learn more about their background, how they came to be here, and things like that. So the other thing that I've been looking into is trying to connect the Gilberts to the context of the wider world and how, they were living in this world where there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of political, social, economic fluctuations, and how are they reacting to it? What are their feelings about what's going on in the world? And so at the Library of Congress, there's a lot of general papers and communications from Cass. And so just a couple of things that I thought were interesting was Cass's thoughts on politics. He was a lifelong member of the Republican Party. He supported Teddy Roosevelt in his first term as president. As far as I could tell, he was less supportive once Teddy Roosevelt started up the Progressive Party. But the Western Union telegram you see on the screen is a telegram from Cass to Herbert Hoover, who was then the Republican candidate for president. And he writes, "You have made a superb campaign, and I'm confident of your victory." There. And so Cass supported and campaigned for several Republican presidential candidates throughout his life. And also we have some of his thoughts on World War I. He was very pro-interventionism throughout the war. And then after the war, he visited Europe many times. But one of the things that I found most fascinating is he met Benito Mussolini in Italy. And he wrote a 10-page long kind of summary of his meeting with Mussolini. And he was very intrigued by Mussolini and some of his plans for Italy. And so that's a very interesting and surprising kind of piece of information that I found, and I am interested in digging more into that. And also throughout the papers, you can see kind of some of his thoughts on immigration, on the immigrant groups that are coming into Ridgefield and New York. During World War I, he does invite the Ridgefield Italian-American Citizens Mutual Aid Society to the Cannonball House to hold one of their meetings and to hear a talk at the Cannonball House. So if you could go to the next slide. So one of the things that I always like to stress is our biggest object in the collection is the house itself, and how we can use the house and the other buildings on the property to really help engage people. And so this space pictured here is our former gift shop, which has been moved, and we are reclaiming it as its original function, which is the pantry for the Gilbert. And so here is kind of the first iteration of the pantry, which you can see on if you visit the museum. And we have a maid, Lizzie, Elizabeth Ritchie, dressed up over in the corner. And so moving forward, we hope to be able to use some of the resources we have in our collection to recreate the pantry as it might have been during the Gilbert time period, and to be able to use it as a space to talk about the staff and employees who were working and on the property and making the property what it is and what it was. So as I said, we've got lots of new faces to explore, new spaces, and plenty of new ideas.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've been spending a lot of time talking about this, but it's really exciting to hear it presented in this way. And so many stories, so much in the collection to explore that, right? You're finding new stuff just yesterday, right? I mean, it's so exciting thinking about all of these different perspectives. I love one of the things that Melissa said earlier about how the students are really connecting with the stories from the past. It's kind of an easier way into some of these larger big picture conversations around civic engagement, or what it means to be an active participant, and talking about privilege and opportunity. But then making those past to present connections, right? And all the different ways where pretty soon it comes like, oh, this sounds like this could have been read from the headlines yesterday. So I love like how all of these stories are really going to bring to life so many different perspectives that we aren't as familiar with, because we often hear that the story of the Gilded Age, right, of the more privileged people, of the wealth, but thinking about what it was like for those longtime Ridgefielders, as well as for those recent immigrants to the area. So really excited. But we'd love to hear from all of you now. So we invite any questions. Please feel free to come off mute if you have a question for Catherine or Melissa about their work, their research, how their programs and the collections are informing this. We'd love to hear from you. If you feel more comfortable, you can use the chat function as well, but we definitely welcome.
So I just have to say, I love absolutely everything that I just heard from you guys. And
Excellent.
I can't wait, first of all, to come and see you guys, because I've never been there. So I'm looking forward to that. And it got me thinking. I'm at the New Haven Museum, and we have a historic house, the Party Morris House. And we were just talking today on how we might go about reinterpreting that space. There's no furniture or anything in the space. And, there are a lot of similarities to what you guys have done in your space to, this space. I'm still learning a lot of the history, but I know that there were Quinnipiacs on the land originally. And then, it also has a colonial history where the house was burned by the British and rebuilt. But then there were boarders that lived in the house at one point. So I think exploring some of those stories in a similar way to what you guys have done
This is for the other computer.
Right.
will be
Plugged into the
really cool. So thank you. This was, and Melissa, one of my favorite time periods too.
There's just too many good stories. I mean,
So
come
much
on,
good stuff.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you
And
could find any thread you want.
yeah, and I think it's the huge differences in that time period that is, is very fascinating.
Definitely. Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's one of the things that we can bring out in the spaces that we have, especially with the Gilbert story, is that they were really the haves. But in the town that they lived in, there were definitely have-nots,
Mhm.
and how do you tell layers of that story? I mean, there's just so much. So
If I could just jump in too, Cynthia, I'm so glad that we'll have to talk offline. I'd love to hear about what you all are doing.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's really cool. I also think that part of the reason that this period is so exciting, and this is not my period of expertise, but I think it's so exciting, and we talked about this a little bit, is that this period of time has just sort of fallen into people's radar as history, and a lot of people still have personal or family connections to this period of time. All right, so those stories of immigration, like the Italian immigrant story, is still very much a part of my identity and what I heard from my grandmother and my great grandparents. And so it's really interesting to see people relate to this in a different way, not a better or worse way, but in a different way, because they have those kinds of personal histories that they're still in touch with and can relate to in different ways than, say, like the colonial era, where most people don't have the same kind of, it feels more immediate connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I have my grandfather's papers, from when he came over in 1910, and then went back and then came back again in 1921. So it's, and I think because everybody has a history. So yeah, I think it's fantastic what you guys have done. I really do.
Excellent. So we do have a question from the chat. How do you plan to integrate the BIPOC presence into reimagining all of your exhibits? I know you've done some great work already there. And Catherine, Melissa, would you like to speak to your plans moving forward?
Yeah, sure. I know there's quite a bit of there's definitely periods of time in the house where Black and Indigenous presence is there. We know that there were enslaved people, enslaved Africans at our site. We know there were free Phyllis Dubois, who was a free Black woman. She lived at our site throughout the 19th century. And so those, we always want to incorporate their stories. We're not just telling the story of the land owners, but we want to know everybody who was living and working at our site. Certainly, I think in the American Dream tour on the site, we're not aware yet of any Black or Indigenous or what or people of color working on the site. That doesn't mean they weren't there. We just haven't found them yet. But we do know that there were people of color in Ridgefields. I would love to be able to explore their stories. And we do know that one of the things that I'm also working on that I didn't mention is the idea of interest in Asia at the time. The idea of Orientalism. We do have several pieces in our collection that are from China and that we're looking into. I know there were Chinese immigrants here in Ridgefield, at least 2 of them, that I'm interested in finding out more about. And so we do know that there are those connections, and it's just a matter of having the time and opportunities to dig into them and to be able to include their stories as well.
I love, you had said earlier, Catherine, how you often describe that, Cass built the garden for Julia and Julia loved to garden, but in fact, right, who was really doing the work? So I'm digging into that and finding out who are the people behind all that needed to happen to bring the house to life at all the different periods, right? I think has been really a part of the intention, and really such an interesting part of the story, to really have that full picture of it. There's a couple more questions as well about how will Cass Gilbert's architecture background be included in the exhibit? And another question about, did any enslaved persons fight in the Battle of Ridgefield?
So I definitely speak to the first question. Cass's architecture and his career as an architect really played an important role in his ability to be able to purchase this property. And his success as an architect really made him, he was a name at the time. And so I think whatever we talk about with him, it does have to go back to his architectural background, his career, the people he met, and his ability to exist in the world and achieve his American dream, perhaps relies on the fact that he was a successful architect. And also the fact that he purchased this property and that he preserved it the way he did, and the changes that he did make to the property all kind of cycled back to his architecture. And so it's definitely not something that can be left out.
Thanks for that, Catherine. Melissa?
I was just going to give some information on the enslaved individuals fighting in the Battle of Ridgefield. So for the Battle of Ridgefield itself, like when the 3 engagements happened within the borders of Ridgefield, we don't know. If you wanted more information, Deborah, I'd recommend that you go to the Ridgefield Historical Society. They've got a whole paper on all of the archaeology that was done for the Battle of Ridgefield. There are some documents that would support there were enslaved individuals who were a part of the larger event, from the disembarking, marching up to Danbury, burning Danbury, marching back to the ships. I know there is records for enslavers petitioning for reimbursement for enslaved individuals who died. So I can't answer that 100%. I can't say whether or not somebody was in Ridgefield who was enslaved and also participating in the battle, unfortunately. I'm sure you know the challenge of records for enslaved individuals in archives, and it's really hard to find documentation unless, like I mentioned, somebody's petitioning for reimbursement for the death of an enslaved individual because enslaved individuals were seen as property. So unless you have a document like that, it's really hard to know, unfortunately.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would love to know, like if I could go backwards in time, I would love to know. I mean, but one of the things that I research is also clothing. And one of the things that I find fascinating is the concept. There's been a lot of popular entertainment recently about women as camp followers. So there's also women who are left out of these records. Like how many women were participating or following husbands or officers or what have you. There's a runaway ad that part of my wardrobe, I have an 18th century wardrobe. Part of my wardrobe is based off of. Anne Hill was a runaway indentured woman, and she joins General Worcester's, or she follows after General Worcester's contingent. So she may have been at the Battle of Ridgefield. Do I know for certain? No. But the description of her clothing as a runaway indentured person is the closest I can get to what a woman would have been wearing at the Battle of Ridgefield. So you can find these documents that bring you really close, but not exactly there, which is a frustrating thing about history, right?
Also, right, that's what keeps us coming back for more, right? You never know what you're going to find and how it's going to help inform that new exhibit or that new tour. So I'm going to be respectful for everyone's time here, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We encourage you to, yes, come visit, take the tour. Keep your questions coming if you have other thoughts, ideas, if you uncover some stories that you think are connected to our American Dream theme. We would love to hear those those as well. And so please be on the lookout for invitations to participate in our prototyping process. We'd love you to come and take the tour as we're trying it out, and participate in some focus groups to share your feedback and lend your voice to the development of this great new tour experience. So thank you to Catherine and to Melissa, Katie for kicking us off, and Hildy for welcoming us, and Sarah, thanks for being here with us tonight too. Deborah, Cynthia, and all of our participants, thank you tonight.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.